Hi, I'm Danielle Kessner, and this is another episode of Paved with Good Intentions. If you like what you see, send... I have to wonder if structural engineers have an inherent fear of the Kool-Aid guy bursting through the wall. Welcome to another episode of Paved with Good Intentions, the show that asks the difficult questions you didn't even think you cared about. This podcast is produced sponsor-free, so thank you for supporting independent artists. Today we're going to be talking about phones. We all have them. We all use them. We're all dependent on them. So that's today's topic. But first, here's a piece of random trivia. Birds are weird, right? I mean, they walk funny, they have crazy eyes, and they're always whistling. What's up with that? But did you know a bird's body temperature is typically 7 to 8 degrees warmer than humans? In fact, up to 75% of the air they breathe is used just to cool down their bodies. And their hearts beat as many as 1,000 times a minute when they're in flight. It's like a Tex Avery cartoon on steroids. And now on to the episode, smartphones and the heads-down generation. When I was a kid, I went on a trip to Las Vegas with my dad and my brother. It was a road trip in the family van across 4 states, which as a kid felt like an eternity. So we had to find ways to pass the time. But it also marked the first time for our family that we bought our own cell phone. And this was at a time when cell phones were still in their inception and gaining popularity. Now, it wasn't one of the shoebox phones that we saw in like 80s movies, but it was still rudimentary, especially by today's standards. And we bought it as a precaution in case we broke down in the middle of Utah, because for anybody who's been into Utah knows there's not a whole lot there. At the time, cell phone networks were not as powerful as they are today. So once we made it to the middle of nowhere, there was no hope that this phone was actually going to work anyway. But it didn't matter to me. I was just fascinated by this new technology. It seemed so futuristic to be able to call someone from your car in the middle of nowhere. And this is at a time when beepers were still a thing. Now maybe I was just a dense child. I'm not really sure. After all, my brother and I spent about $400 of my dad's hard-earned gambling money in the arcade trying to win a $200 Super Nintendo. And we did win it, by the way. And I look back on this situation because it's amazing how excited I was about this cell phone. It didn't do anything but call. It was just a phone with a retractable antenna and a flip receiver. And you compare that to where we are today, and it's a completely different world. When the telephone was first invented, it was revolutionary because it was a way for two people to talk from a distance as if they were in the same room. It was like me talking to George 2 towns over. We could talk to each other as if we were right next to each other. To us today, it's second nature, but back then it was revolutionary. And it seems kind of silly, but it had to start somewhere. And over time, phones innovated to become more useful. They became more powerful. They became more connected. Soon it became not just you could call somebody across the street, you could call somebody across the country and then across the world. And eventually phones began to do more. You could actually even see who was calling. Unfortunately, we didn't call them prophecy boxes at this point, but that would have been a cool name. People eventually saw this use for phones as a multi-communication tool. And so what started as a very simple communication open space communication became this idea that we could use phones for so much more. And as we see today, phones are definitely used for far more than just me calling somebody. Like I can call you, but I can also do a whole bunch of other things. I can text you, I can Vox you, I can do a video chat, or we could play Tetris or something. I don't know, whatever people do these days. And that's because we have smartphones, and everybody has a smartphone. And when I say everybody, that doesn't mean every single person, but a majority of people have smartphones, and they use them on a daily basis. They're practically attached to their hand. And I'm sure that's coming, where we're going to have surgically attached phones to our hands. But now the concept of the smartphone has been around since the 1970s. So even though we haven't had the internet in a wide mass usage. We haven't had phones with, the kind of touch technology that we have today. We haven't had those, since the last decade. The concept of the smartphone has been around since the 70s as computing became more powerful, as we started to see these massive computing systems start to be miniaturized into smaller personal use computers. So the concept came around at that point of taking that technology of the computer, using it with the concept of the phone, and putting the two together. So it was this device for both computing and for phoning. This is what came up in the 1970s. And the first smartphone, even though it was highly rudimentary, came out in 1993. In 94, IBM released what was called the IBM Simon, which was basically kind of the first run of a smartphone, because what it could do was it could call, but it could also fax, it could email, it had an address book, a calendar, a calculator, basically what PDA features eventually would develop. So the IBM Simon was kind of the first smartphone concept that we had. Now the word smartphone didn't actually appear, and it's the amount of times we use it today seems kind of surprising that the first time it actually did appear was in 1995 with AT&T's phone writer communicator. In the late 90s, early 2000s, we saw the rise of PDAs, which were personal digital assistants. These personal digital assistants, if anybody remembers, they look kind of like a smartphone, but you had to have a stylus to be able to do any kind of the computing functions. But from these PDAs, we got sort of our forerunners of iOS software, of mobile operating systems, sort of came out of using these PDAs. Eventually, we saw these concepts start to actually come into practice outside of the US. In Japan, there was this mass adoption of these smartphone type concepts, or basically, as we would think of it, as more mobile internet. So pre-3G, in Japan, they used something called iMode. In the 2000s, mid-2000s, we started seeing a surge in these mobile internet usage in the United States, particularly with BlackBerry. BlackBerry started gaining popularity in the early and mid-2000s. It was released in 2003 and quickly got the name Crackberry for being so addictive. Sound familiar? Well, before iPhones and all that stuff, we had BlackBerry, and that was definitely an addictive way to, use the internet, communicate, do all that stuff with this phone with a cool little device. But then everything changed in 2007 when Apple introduced the iPhone. And the iPhone was significant because it was the first multi-touch interface phone. So instead of having a keyboard, a cursor, anything like that, without having to use a stylus or anything, basically you'd have the phone, you have the screen, and you could do all the functions just with a touch of the finger. It seems weird again today, but this was pretty revolutionary at the time. A year later, Apple got its first taste of competition from Android in 2008, and Android took a little while to get going, but by 2010, Android was actually a pretty significant stake in the market, and now it's pretty much Apple and Android are two of the biggest mobile operating system providers. And with the rise of the iPhone and the Android, it also saw a lot of kind of the older features going away, things like having a physical keyboard. So phones that, before, you'd flip open the keyboard, you could do all that stuff, was really kind of cool. Well, with iPhone and Android, with these multi-touch interface, that keyboard became unnecessary, so we started to see that thing go away. Nowadays, cell phones are used for everything, including photography, high-resolution photography, gaming, commerce. We have things like Apple Pay, that you can pay something right from your phone, apps, social media. They do everything for us, including cat videos. And as such, we depend on them. Here's the point here. Phones provide us this convenient way to organize and collect info quickly. We can look up anything we want at the touch of a button. And it's so much that can be done on one small device. It's nice having this phone. You can do just about anything on this phone. But there's implications with that. There's this social impact, Because so many people spend so much of their time looking down at their phones, and they interact with that more than they interact with people. And that includes children, parents interacting with their phone more than with their children. I remember a story my mom told me about a friend of hers who, after years of being married, she went on a date with a guy, and they talked online for a little bit. And after they, got to know each other, they went out on a date. When they did, he spent the entire date quiet, not doing anything, just kind of looking down. She was trying to talk and converse and all that. Eventually, he texted her kind of like hi over his phone. That's an extreme example, but it kind of shows that there's this, detachment that people have experienced with their phones, is they're kind of detached from the rest of society. And that can have an emotional impact because now their entire livelihood is poured into this device. So if they're away from their phone, it can be depressing, or if they're around people, they'd rather spend time on their phone, and it can create loneliness. It's like the phone becomes a pacifier. And then there's also the dangers of it when driving or walking. You're playing on your phone driving, next thing you know, you hit the back of a bus. It happens all the time. We hear about it. People, distracted driving or distracted walking. They walk into people, or they walk into the street and get hit by a car. There's the physical strain of it, sitting here like this all day, just like texting and all that. You get text neck, which means you're pretty much looking at your feet all day, or blurry vision. It's an addiction. Like any other addiction, addiction to a phone is just as much an addiction. But it makes you wonder if it even has a greater impact than that. We're talking about just like, some physical danger, some practical dangers, but does it have a greater impact as well? Well, it does actually, because using smartphones may actually be affecting our memory. Because now we have this convenient tool to store information and to get information. So why do we need to remember this stuff if I can just pull up my phone, pull up Wikipedia, pull up Google, do anything like that, and get that information at the touch of a button? So there's this concept that's called digital amnesia, which means you don't know dates, you don't know facts, you don't know phone numbers, you don't know any of this stuff, because the phone is your lifeline. Your phone is your memory. And so when you lose your phone, then there's panic, there's sadness, there's anger, there's any of that stuff. And this sort of digital memory may actually have long-term consequences on human memory, because it eliminates short-term memory. If you don't have to remember something because you can look it up on your phone, you won't remember something. And education, the point of education has always been to train our brains to retain information. That's why they pummel you with facts and they pummel you with all this information in school. That's a way to train your brain to retain this information. If you can just get all that information on a phone, why do you need to remember it? Why do you need to know that stuff? But the other aspect of it is that we have that tool that gives us access to information more so than ever. We have access to everything. And for millennials particularly, so the younger generation, they are so adept at harvesting that information and utilizing it for their jobs, for education, and for understanding the world around them. The millennial generation is far more open-minded and creative and progressive than we've seen necessarily in the past. That's not to say past generations weren't creative or open-minded, but the millennial generation, because they're seeing so much more from the start, from the get-go, it's making them more progressively minded, more open-minded to the world around them. But of course, there's still the social concerns with that, and attitudes for that matter. But that doesn't mean that because millennials are less social, personable, or they might have, very egocentric personalities, that doesn't mean that they can't contribute a great deal. Oddly enough, though, they'll do it without actually talking on the phone. Mostly they'll just text. I'm that way. I hate talking on the phone. And that's because phones are becoming such powerful tools with multiple purposes. It's no longer this concept of we have a wire between two distant points and we can communicate between the two of them. Now, I can communicate with somebody on the other side of the world, just at the touch of a button. It goes into space, communication comes down, we're good. It's such a powerful tool. And we can play Scrabble too. I can play Scrabble with somebody in India if I want to. And that concept that we have with the smartphone is actually spilling over into other smart tech, like smartwatches. We see that a lot. Apple launched their Apple Watch this year, but that was hardly the first smartwatch out there. There's also a greater integration of all media. So I can take my phone and I can watch Netflix on my phone. I can play games. I can contact people. I can listen to music. I can write on my phone if I want to. There's so many things that you can do with these phones. There's also potentially the use of AR with the phones, and that's augmented reality. So think about holding up your phone with, a street view of, an area, and it'll tell you this is what is in this building, this what is in this building. There's a mailbox, things like that. Like, we can use the phone as this like massive resource when finding things. There's also the possibility of built-in projectors. To be able to take your phone, set it down, put it up against the wall, and next thing you know, you're watching a movie on basically a project. It creates that projection for you. There's the idea of flexible screens. Better voice control and integration. I mean, we use Siri. We use things like Siri and what was the other one? Cortana. And we get better voice control, better voice interaction with the phones. There's even the possibility of getting 3D displays. So, I mean, there's all this like sci-fi technology that once upon a time seemed like this distant possibility, that now we're actually starting to see people explore those options, explore the practicality of it, and to bring that futuristic feel to us in reality. So it's a very cool time right now. And as easy as it is to criticize our dependence on smartphones, we can't ignore the technological advances that we've had with them. But the fact is, people do lament how much time we do spend on our phones. And I'm not saying that they're wrong. I'm not saying that, sitting there looking down at your phone the entire time is necessarily a good thing. It isn't. But it is not necessarily a good excuse to say we shouldn't even explore the technology. And our dependence on smartphones is actually, like I said, having this almost evolutionary impact. But they're here to stay. I mean, we're not getting rid of phones anytime soon. They're still going to be here for a long time. And as they get more advanced, they're going to develop into even more powerful tools for us. But why, I mean, like I said, what's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that inherently, because they provide us with so much. We have this tool, this like magical tool in our hand that gives us access to everything. But as such, we depend on them. Some of us even sleep with our phones right at our side. And as the technology continues to advance, we're going to advance with it. We're going to continue to see these science fiction concepts come to life in our hands with these phones. And it's very exciting, actually, to see what we can do, where we came from a point where you basically had two cans on a wire communicating, to this point where you can use your phone for pretty much anything. Except cooking waffles. I still want that waffle maker phone. One day. We'll just have to get used to looking at the top of someone's head instead of looking them in the eye. It's a pretty big price to pay, but that's what we are. We're in the heads down generation right now. We're in the generation where everybody is looking at their phones. Everyone has their phone in hand, and that phone is as much a part of them as their personality, as their political views, as anything about them. That phone it's their memory. But really what they're looking at is the future. They're looking at, this is what is going to happen. This is what we're going to see moving forward in the future. And it's only going to get better from here. Socially, not so much. But it's going to get technologically mind-blowing. So. Thank you for watching. Check out more Paved with Good Intentions right here on YouTube. You can also check out my other videos and anything I've ever favorited, including Amorphous songs. I am going to be adding some more videos here pretty soon, so check those out. And listen to my other podcast, Translation, which can be found at the link below, as well as on iTunes and Stitcher. And then visit me on Twitter at Danny Kessner, or you can find me on Facebook. If you have any questions you'd like me to ponder on the show, send me an email at translationpodcast@gmail.com. I do want to hear from you, so please get in touch, say hi, tell me what for. And once again, this podcast is produced sponsor-free, so thank you for supporting independent artists. See you on the other side.